When Michelangelo was a little boy, one of his friends gave him a small Greek sculpture of human form, half chiseled from the marble. For the rest of his life, Michelangelo kept that little statue by his bed. It was the very last thing he saw at night before he went to sleep. It was the very first thing he saw when he woke in the morning. For him, it became a symbol of man's anguished effort to be liberated from the prison of his own ignorance. Michelangelo devoted his whole life to freeing figures from stone. Sometimes it would take months, even years. He always began with a vision, the vision of a man or a woman locked up in stone. And he wrote, "It is my job, my task, to see that man and that woman free." Such was the inspiration of that great man, and indeed, the inspiration of the great movement of which we know he was an exemplar, which we call the Renaissance. But Michelangelo was not the first to dedicate his whole life to freeing figures from stone. In the gospel I just read, Jesus picked up that scroll and read that magnificent piece from Isaiah. And he tells us that that is fulfilled in him, that he has been sent to bring glad tidings to the poor, to free prisoners from captivity, to proclaim liberty to captives. There are many captives in our world today. There are many people locked up in stone. There are many prisoners needing to be freed, to be liberated, whether it's the stones of terrorism, poverty, racism, sexism, anger, betrayal, bitterness, fear. The world is full of stone prisons. And the gospel challenges each one of us to be liberators, to free ourselves from the prisons that encapsulate us, and then to work to free the prisons that others find themselves in. But first of all, each one of us has to be willing to take a very deep look at ourselves, at our families, at your marriages. We first of all have to be willing to acknowledge the prisons that might enslave us. Am I enslaved by my anger? Am I enslaved by my bitterness? Am I enslaved by a hurt that I cannot let go of? Am I enslaved by my prejudices, by my partisanship, by my unwillingness to listen and compromise? The list goes on. Each one of you could add something else, something different. And then each one of us has to ask ourselves, is this enslavement, is it ruining my family? Is it ruining my career? Is it ruining my marriage? Is it ruining my vocation? Jesus became one of us. He became a human in order to free us from that which enslaves us. But first of all, we must want to be freed. Many people don't. Many people are oblivious to the stone prisons that they find themselves in. And many people, we all know, spend their whole lives complaining and moaning about how horrible life is, but they're just unwilling to truly understand the source of their misery, to truly understand that which imprisons them. And it really is only when we truly face the prisons we are lost in that then we can respond to the call that Christ gives us in the gospel to truly be liberators of each other. Each one of us has to individually chisel the stone out of our lives. And then perhaps the world can free itself from the prison of violence that we find ourselves in, that we see on TV every day. Or we can free ourselves, or our government can then free itself from the prison of partisanship and mediocrity that it finds itself in these days. There's a story of a man who became a prisoner for some misdeed that simply angered the king of his particular country. He was arrested and shut up in a dungeon beneath the castle. A ferocious-looking jailer carrying a long key escorted the man down a dark stairway. The door of the cell was opened, and the man was thrust into a dark hole. The door shut with a bang, and there he was. He laid in that dark dungeon for 20 years. Each day the jailer would come. The big door would be opened with a great creaking and a groaning, and a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread would be shoved into the cell, and the door closed again. After 20 years, the prisoner decided that he couldn't just stand it any longer. He wanted to die, but he didn't want to commit suicide, so he decided that the next day when the jailer came, he would attack him, and the jailer in self-defense would then kill him and end his misery. So to prepare for the next day, he decided to examine the door carefully. And when he went to the door, he caught the handle, he turned it, and to his amazement, the door opened. And upon investigation, he found that there was no lock. There never had been a lock. For those 20 years, he had not been locked in at all, except in his belief. At any time during that period, he could have opened the door and been free. He thought it was locked, and it wasn't. So he groped along the corridor and felt his way upstairs. At the top of the stairs, 2 soldiers were chatting, and they made no attempt to stop him. He crossed the great yard without attracting attention. The armed guard at the drawbridge at the great gate paid no attention to him, and he walked out a free man. He went home untouched, and he lived happily ever after. He could have left at any time, if only he was willing to test the door, to see if it was open. The stones that held him captive were of his own making. He was locked in by his own choice not to investigate that which he thought could never unlock. I really think it's safe to say that we are all prisoners to some extent of our own making. We may find ourselves imprisoned by our anger, our resentment, our remorse, our guilt. There's so many ways we can be imprisoned. Or the belief that there are no options for us in our lives or in our jobs, that we are locked into what we are currently doing. So maybe as we reflect upon that magnificent quote from Isaiah, that Jesus tells us that that was his main goal when he came to be one of us, to free us. Maybe we're being asked today to reflect upon what are the prisons that I might find myself in today. And often remember the prison is in our own thoughts. And the key to our release is our desire to be free. Michelangelo spent his entire life freeing figures from stone. Jesus came to free us from the stones that imprison us, the stones that create so much misery for us and for others. There are many kinds of imprisonment in our world today. We all know that, internationally and nationally. But we all have to start with ourselves. Our God sent Jesus not to enslave us, not to just give us rules and regulations. He sent Jesus to free us. The question is, do we want to be let out of the stone prisons of our own anger or self-righteousness or opinions or lack of openness? Michelangelo saw that statue as a symbol of man's anguished effort to be liberated from the prison of his own ignorance. Well, what about us today? As we hear that quote from Isaiah, will we allow the grace of the Lord to truly free us? The prison door is open. We only need to walk through it.